my name's Glenn Weinreb. I'm the director of the Manhattan 2 Project, and we're a nonprofit that studies how to resolve climate change at lowest cost. And I'm going to talk about why resolving climate change should be easy. I understand it might not seem easy, but I'm going to make the case that it should be easy. First, some background information. Resolving climate change entails transitioning from a carbon-based economy to one that does not emit CO2. This is referred to as decarbonization, and it costs money. More specifically, it typically costs $10 to $40 to avoid putting a ton of CO2 into the atmosphere. And economically, this is what happens when you build a solar farm or wind farm or a hydroelectric dam. The United States emits approximately 5 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere each year. And if you reduce this to zero over 30 years, you'd have to reduce it by 170 million tons a year. And that's because 5 billion divided by 30 is 170 million. Now, if you take the 170 million and multiply by the $40 that it costs to avoid a ton of CO2, you get the number $7 billion. And that's the cost to decarbonize the United States for the first year. Also, you can look at this in terms of what is that cost for a family of 4 people. There's 80 million family of 4 equivalents in the United States, and if we take 7 billion divided by 80 million, we get $90. $90 is the cost for a family to decarbonize for the first year, and this shows up as an increase in the cost of goods and services. Also, decarbonization costs go up over time. So infrastructure is paid for with borrowed money, so it's a little bit like having 1 mortgage to pay after 1 year, 2 mortgages to pay after 2 years, and so forth and so on. So the cost to the family is $90 for the first year, $180 for year 2, and in year 10, you could be looking at $900. Now, a family may consider $90 acceptable, yet may be more uncomfortable with $900. However, evidence of climate change goes up each year, which means that tolerance of decarbonization costs is likely to go up each year. So to decarbonize, you need for cost to stay below tolerance as you go through time. And to do that, one should consider decarbonizing in lowest cost order. In other words, tackle your projects that are $10 per ton projects in year 1 and your $20 per ton projects in year 2, and so forth and so on. Now, to mathematically decarbonize in lowest cost order and at lowest cost, one can assemble a list of decarbonization projects such as solar farms and wind farms. And step 2 is to calculate the cost to avoid a ton of CO2 with each project. And step 3 is to sort your list by that value. And then step 4 is to grab a 170 million ton batch of projects for year 1, and then a 170 million ton batch of projects for year 2. And then step 5 is to suggest laws that require those projects. And an example is California requires that 3% of CO2 be decarbonized each year. So that's mathematically decarbonizing to zero in lowest cost order at lowest cost. Now, one can look at this politically. According to a survey, 95% of Democrats want to decarbonize, 40% of Republicans want to decarbonize. In total, you're looking at 65%. And then you could ask the question, why are we not decarbonizing if there's political support? The reason is very interesting. If you look at the proposals that are put forth to decarbonize, mostly by Democrats, they have components in the proposal, and some of those have a high cost per ton of CO2 avoided, and other components have a low cost per ton of CO2 avoided. And the fiscal conservatives don't like the components that have the high cost. An example of high cost is electricity from solar on houses costs 4 times more than electricity from solar farms. So if you're looking for political support, consider decarbonizing exclusively from low-cost sources. Also, one needs to deal with multiple challenges, one of which is called not in my backyard, and that's where communities resist building solar farms and wind farms because they do not like how they look. And to deal with this, we should consider setting up green energy production zones in areas of the United States that are looking for economic activity and are willing to put up with government regulation that facilitates low-cost decarbonization in return for that activity. For example, in a green energy production zone, a government office could have the authority to demand right-of-way for power wires and farmers and ranchers could have the right to build solar farms and wind farms in a streamlined process. Also, you need to get electricity from your solar farms and your wind farms to your cities, which means you need power wires. And oftentimes getting the land for power wires is difficult. And the easiest way of doing this is probably to have a government office with the authority to replace existing power wires with larger power wires on a widened tract of land, so you don't need an additional tract of land. And another challenge is something called saturation. That's where you build up your solar farms and your wind farms to the point where you've got enough electricity when it's both sunny and windy. So if you add another solar farm, you'll just discard that electricity when it's sunny, or you'll put the electricity into batteries, both of which is expensive. So we're at risk of running into a situation where decarbonization costs are exceeding what voters are willing to tolerate. And that could occur 5 to 15 years from now. So we have some low-cost sources for decarbonization that we can chew on for a while, but at some point, this could become more expensive. So to deal with this, we should consider more R&D. The US government has national laboratories like the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which develop gadgets that explore outer space. And in theory, we could have a new national laboratory which developed gadgets that reduce decarbonization costs. Perhaps this would be called the National Decarbonization Laboratory. Perhaps this would be administered by MIT. And right now you have Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which is overseen by Caltech, and this provides fantastic opportunities for faculty and staff, and there's two separate institutions with a 20-minute drive between them. So in theory, you could have something like a national decarbonization lab somewhere in the Boston area, administered by MIT, providing opportunities for MIT students who want to tackle climate change. And the lab could do things like automate the placing of solar panels on buildings, automate the placing of solar on land, and other activities. Also, you could, in theory, have multiple decarbonization labs. Elon could have the Musk decarbonization lab, Bill could have the Gates decarbonization lab, and they could collaborate with Joe's national decarbonization lab. And a big question to ask is, what would you potentially do at these labs? And that's where my organization comes in. We specialize in studying billion-dollar-sized R&D that tackles climate change. And nobody else does this. If you do a search for papers, you're not going to see this. And we've published 25 articles that discuss this. And to see these articles, one can go to the Manhattan2.org website and then click and get to a magazine where they're available free of charge. You don't need to register. You don't need to pay money. These are available to the public. And we're also interested in consolidating them and putting them into a book. And we're working on a business plan for a decarbonization laboratory, and we're going to make that document free and open, which means that anybody will be able to copy and modify at no charge. And an important question to ask is, how can you justify spending billions of dollars on R&D? Well, if you look at the cost of the infrastructure that does not emit CO2, you're looking at approximately $100 trillion. So that's the cost for 1.5 billion cars that do not emit CO2, all the power plants that do not emit CO2, and the factories that do not emit CO2. And that's a cost worldwide that could be spent over 30 years. So if you can reduce a $100 trillion number down 10%, you just saved $10 trillion. If that cost you $100 billion, then you're spending billions of dollars to save trillions of dollars, and that's reasonable. So a question for scientists is, how can we spend hundreds of billions of dollars to tackle climate change? Also, you could extend this question to MIT. How could MIT better tackle climate change given billions of dollars of additional funding? And I think this would be a terrific TEDx event where all the talks focus on this one question so that then faculty and students could hear the ideas from the campus as to how MIT could better tackle climate change given more money. Now, if you're the President of the United States and you're talking with your energy team about climate change, you might ask a simple question. Let's say you're not a scientist and engineer, okay? Let's say your background is humanities. You're going to ask a simple question. How do I fix this? And you might get a simple answer back. Accelerate the development of fusion power with more money. And I'll say that again. Accelerate the development of fusion power with more money. And several weeks ago, we published an article that talks about this. Also, several months ago, we published an article about how to decarbonize transportation, given billions of dollars of additional money for R&D. The US government has projected energy emissions from CO2 from transportation over the next 30 years to be constant. That is, they're not going towards zero. So if you want to tackle transportation, consider putting in more money than we're already doing. Also, several months ago, we published an article about how to wrap building roof and wall surfaces with solar skins, given billions of dollars to develop the machines to do this. Now, to help with our articles, we've sponsored research at universities. We've had 25 students do R&D that reduce CO2. For example, we had a team at U of Mass work on solar skin for buildings. And also, we've worked on buildings, and an interesting question to ask about buildings is, what might buildings look like 100 years from now? And you'll probably have a processor in every device, and they'll be networked together, and they'll coordinate to reduce energy consumption. And devices will include things like appliances, HVAC equipment, a light switch, a light socket, things like that. And to get these devices to coordinate well with each other, you may want to place the same operating system software on every device. And last year, we wrote an operating system that does this. It's called Building Bus, and it's on the internet, and anybody can download the source code and change it, modify it, rename at no cost. The US government has an organization called EIA, which estimates CO2 emissions over the course of the next 30 years, and they're estimating that the CO2 emissions are not going towards zero, but instead in line to remain constant. And this is because of simple economics, which is that consumers buy the lowest cost solution independent of CO2 emissions. So if you want to decarbonize, you have to require it by law. However, decarbonization law doesn't exist, although it could exist. And if you want it to exist, consider putting together a team and giving them the following assignment. Suggest a federal law that decarbonizes to zero over 30 years at lowest cost, in lowest cost order, and in a way that is likely to be supported by both Republicans and Democrats who do want to decarbonize. And consider staffing your team with former energy secretaries, former treasury secretaries, Republican lawmakers that want to decarbonize, and people who've written books on decarbonization, such as Bill Gates and John Doerr. And for an example of what a decarbonization law might look like, one can see our website. In conclusion, resolving climate change should be easy. Thank you.